Hello, and welcome to Forget What You Learned, a place for families to stop and reflect on the modern state of education. We empower you to challenge your own thinking about today's traditional school system and ask the question, are my kids thriving? I'm Corey Greenberg, a parent in the trenches just like you, and I chat with innovators, experts, and other parents who are changing the conversation, inspiring families to reevaluate how we define academic success. This podcast is brought to you by Pacific Preparatory and Tutor Corps, sister organizations molding education through innovative one-on-one learning for students in today's digital world. In today's episode, I talk with Matt Perry, a seasoned educator who has a unique approach to teaching history, infusing the use of storytelling, decision-making, and personal connections to really bring it alive for students. It's not just about dates and ancient wars. Matt uses his time with students to truly see them for who they are, which serves as the basis for developing a true mentor relationship. We dive into how and why this is critical for our kids. And lastly, we look at the outcomes he's seen for kids who have not always followed the traditional academic path. Join us. Hello, and welcome to the show. Today, I'm going to talk with a very seasoned educator who has taught students across the lifespan in over 50 courses and created curriculum from scratch for most of those. His approach to social studies teaching in particular emphasizes storytelling and the psychological components of decision-making to help students personalize history and access the rich web of lessons we can draw from it. He's also designed board games, recorded oral histories, written for law firms, and co-founded an edtech startup. Matt Perry has also, incidentally, been teaching and tutoring with Tutor Corps and Pacific Preparatory for over 14 years and is consistently revered by students and families alike. We actually brought him here today to discuss the unique way that Matt infuses his courses with a big old dose of mentoring, and how teaching content while helping to develop real life skills truly go hand in hand. We'll dive into the specifics of how teachers and maybe even parents can do this with all our kids, even within the structure of a traditional classroom. But I also can't wait to hear his perspective on what the future looks like for students who haven't had such a traditional path. Hi, Matt.
Hi.
Let's start with your unique approach to teaching history, which for many students seems like a big old bore. Memorizing dates and studying ancient wars. How and why do you try to make this come alive?
Yeah, it is so important to do that, to make history come alive, because there's so many lessons that students can take away from history, especially the American history that they are currently living in and contributing to. So I think first and foremost, you mentioned storytelling, making sure that students have a sense that history, when it was being lived, was immediate. These were real people, individuals struggling and having to make up their minds about things on a daily basis, just like we do. And so trying to learn enough about key figures and moments in history to tell stories that are as rich as the best novels, to my students, and to engage them in a way that they're asking questions like they maybe can't of a novel or a movie. And then, trying to get deeper inside the life stories of those people. So that's first thing. And then the second thing you mentioned, decision making. I think teenagers especially are having to face so many new decisions and challenging decisions every day. And to a teenager, as we all know, it seems like you're the first person to ever face this crisis or, this challenge. But being able to see that people throughout history have faced these same kinds of challenges with incredible stakes, I think is really important. And to try to work through, what was the process that led them to the decisions they ended up making. So those are two big approaches that I think can bring history alive for middle schoolers and high schoolers especially.
Yeah, so it's really getting inside and then also outside. So inside in terms of like what is the student's personal connection to this historical figure who on the surface of it may seem to have nothing in common in terms of their daily life, you know? So also just like for you trying to help them understand like where the commonalities are and then also seeing outside of themselves in terms of like how did this actually affect what I'm doing now and what our
Mm.
society's like? Is that can you say more about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to put it. Um, I think that finding a connection to where our students are at is so important. This last semester, I was trying to convey how amazing an individual Benjamin Franklin was. Um, and, he pops up in so many different realms in our early history. So I thought, well, I'll just create a resume as if he was applying for a job like, my students might be applying for a summer job. And so, yeah, with my student, we went through his resume and we were like, okay, this is what he's qualified for in this domain. This is what he's qualified. And stuff like that, I think can help connect on that kind of internal level. Like, okay, here's where this person, may have been at, and here's where you're at. And it's actually kind of similar. That external connection though, too, that's really important. Like, how did you phrase it a minute ago?
Well, it's kind of like seeing out students seeing outside of
Mm,
themselves. It's something I've been reading a lot about
yeah,
in terms of like, in the context of our kids' mental health is that one of the ways we offset that the struggles that they're having, all these pressures, is to help them to see outside of themselves. So when you were talking about history, I wondered if that's a way for students to be able to see, what they do in their lives actually impacts
right,
civilization as a whole. I mean, not to be
right.
hyperbolic.
Well, here's a story that I tell a lot. Um, I also try to connect history to my own life, and we all have these intersections with famous people or with historical events, and here's one that I think gets to what you're saying. I grew up in rural Maine, a couple towns over from a little girl named Samantha Smith. And Samantha Smith became famous in the early 80s for writing to the Soviet premier and basically asking him, why do you want war with our country? Can't we just have peace? And he responded and invited her and her family over to the Soviet Union. And this was happening just a couple towns from where I lived, and I had been having some of these same thoughts. Of course, this was the era of the nuclear war drills where we had to get under our desks, like that was going to do anything. Um, but and she became a sort of celebrity for a couple of years, and then tragically, she and her dad died in a plane crash, literally a few miles from my house on their way home. And I think this was the first time that I realized, okay, I have my petty struggles in life. I didn't get picked for the baseball team or whatever. But here's this girl who's literally my age, changing the world. She's being a more effective ambassador for peace than any of the people in our government. Um, and and here she has become famous. She initiated change. She became famous, and then she died all within the space of a few years, and all within the space of a few miles of my house. So we all have these kind of intersections with history, even in our own time. But especially, if we're learning the whole course of history in a engaging way, that can help us do just what you were saying, and that is to get perspective and see ourselves in the big picture.
That's such a fascinating story. And I mean, immediately I thought of Greta Thunberg. Like,
Mm,
what was her name? Samantha Smith was sort of like
yeah,
the Greta Thunberg,
yeah,
predecessor. And that is a good
absolutely.
example of like what young people can do and just kind of inspiring them to make change. I imagine that doesn't happen with every student that you work with, but maybe in small ways sometimes.
I I try. I think every student obviously has lots of potential, and it's sometimes just the smallest nudge in one direction or another can change a life. Um, there's a line in one of my favorite books, which is called "The Power of One" by Bryce Courtney, set in South Africa during apartheid. And several of the characters use a traditional greeting. They say to each other, "I see you," "I see you, Corey," "I see you, Matt." And I think that's first and foremost, what I try to bring to every class is to let my students feel I see them. And, I think just that feeling in and of itself can be empowering for all of us. And if you combine that, with a recognition that they have insights to bring to any conversation, even, if their answer is technically wrong or whatever, there's probably some deeper insights in there. Then, yeah, I mean, I think if you can do that in every case, then every kid hopefully comes away with um, another little building block in their self-esteem or their toolkit to succeed.
Well, and it sounds like the very first step in the mentoring relationship that you feel so strongly about, right? Is like a feeling seen is the first piece, like having an authentic connection with the other person. So, how else do you how do you build on that? Like once you've made the connection and the student feels that from you, where do you go from there with them?
Yeah, you get to know what they're passionate about, what they talk about or do when they don't have to talk about or do anything else. Um, I try to always get to know where they live and what they know about what they live. I have one student now, who lives in a kind of remote town in Montana, and he he listens to his parents talk about local politics and local economics, and so I know that he often has some event or idea about what's happening around him that we might be able to connect to while we were doing medieval history. So, we're talking about Genghis Khan or something, and he might have something about local politics and leadership that he could bring to that conversation. So I think it's that, like, getting to know a kid in their context, um, but also maybe telling them about some new things that they've never thought about or done, and sharing my own passions. I love go birding. So I'll often sort of sneak in little like random facts about rare birds or something in their area and see if I can pique their interest and um, try to make everything relevant to the lesson, but also not restricting myself artificially to just, learning exactly what we were supposed to be learning on that day and letting the conversation roam a little bit.
That's what I think is so important for people to understand about the mentoring relationship is that in order to sort of impart wisdom, which is one piece, I think people conceptualize the mentoring relationship as the mentor, imparting this life wisdom to the mentee. But the piece of connecting to the student first to be able for them to hear you, for them to want to hear you, the first piece is always getting to know who they are, right? Like we already discussed is in being authentic, but just listening to them first, right? Before you're able to share not only about birding, but like if something comes up in a class and you want to talk about it in terms of their life, like you got to hear them before you give advice, I guess, kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Every young person has things they want to say. Um, they may not be things that they have felt able to say to their friends or their teachers or parents or siblings or whomever. And somehow, a teacher, especially a one-on-one teacher, and nowadays in the era of remote teaching, um, there's this interesting intersection of intimacy and anonymity where you hopefully a student feels able and wants to share something with this person that they're only seeing on a screen, but somehow they feel connected to in a really fundamental way. um, and I know a lot of educators have lamented um, the the COVID driven change, over to remote learning. But I actually think there's tons of potential, to navigate that sort of interesting and fruitful intersection. I used to do a lot of one-on-one tutoring in person, and you can uh, get that same thing across of listening to a student and developing that hopefully organic and robust connection. But there's also these added um, elements of tension, especially if you're in the student's home. There may be things going on in the family that you can hear happening in the house that are maybe a little off-putting, um, or there's just the animals are running around, or the younger siblings or whatever. Um, so you don't have those same kinds of distractions and tensions, I think, in remote learning. Um, so yeah, I think hopefully students and teachers are adapting to this new um, format, and are able to emphasize some of its advantages. And I think really um, authentic communication is one of those.
Yes, I mean, I think you're right, and I think the one-on-one model, when it's done extremely well, it's as close to being shoulder to shoulder with a student as humanly possible, right? Which is very, very different from what we all survived during COVID. I mean, have three school age kids and we all watched, school on TV for a while. That's kind of how we described it, with, the full classrooms and teachers having to just really adapt very quickly to that. And so the one-on-one model is really different in the remote world. I'm curious what you think of, if you think of like a traditional classroom, how have you yourself, or can you see teachers integrating your model in terms of like, we can use history as an example of like, how do you make it come alive in a classroom full of kids when you're not one on one?
That's a great question. Well, certainly the storytelling aspect. I've had great luck with storytelling in a classroom.
Yeah.
If there's a way to get kids to pay attention, it's to tell them a story that seems on the surface like it's not super relevant to the lesson, but as a teacher is, and you're going to bring it around in the end. There's a way to sneak some good learning in there. So absolutely storytelling, and some of us are kind of born storytellers, and some not so much, but it's a skill that can be learned certainly and practiced. So I would encourage all teachers to save a little bit of time every now and then to even tell a personal story uh, that might seem irrelevant, but hopefully you can find a way to connect it. So that would be number one. Number two, I think, in terms of the decision making and analyzing how decisions are made, I think you can do small group work with that, where you can either give every little group the same quandary to consider, and to try to think about the possible motivations and limitations, constraints, systems that the individuals in history had to work within, and to have them generate uh, options for how to address this quandary, or how to come up with a solution. Or you can present them the options and then ask them to choose one as a group and come up with some rationale for that particular choice. And presumably, if it's a tough uh, situation, different groups will come up with different um, solutions or different rationales, and that can lead to a really interesting group discussion afterward, I think. Um, but I think in general, over the course of a semester, a teacher, even if they have 30 kids, can try to find little hooks, with each kid. For one kid, it might be the shared hobby, or for another kid, it might be a shared experience, either a positive one, um, or potentially negative one. Like, I was bullied as a kid, so I often am able to connect with kids who are being bullied or have been bullied. Um, and once you find that little hook with each kid, then you can kind of play on that, and use that to try to bring them into any lesson or discussion. Um, so yeah, those are some ways I think that you can build that sort of mentoring model and the storytelling and the thinking about the psychology of decisions, all into a larger classroom as well.
I also imagine like I mean just thinking back to my own, school experience, I think the opportunities to write personal narratives even within the context of, what you're learning about, like connecting yourself to a character from history or something like that were the ones that seemed the most engaging. So, I think that maybe that speaks to exactly what you're talking about. It's just kind of again like just letting these kids zoom out a little bit and see like what they can do out in the world that's actually related to what's already happened. Yeah.
Hmm. I love that idea of, yeah, using self-expression, as a way. It could be writing, it could be art, sculpture, map design, whatever, as a way to help them connect to the material and to see the larger potential, understandings that can be based on that. In terms of the writing, with my American history students, I often share a letter that was written by a Civil War soldier. It was featured 30 years ago on Ken Burns's Civil War documentary series. It was written by a young soldier named Sullivan Ballou, and it's incredibly eloquent. He says, "I am willing, completely willing, to lay down all my joys in this life to help maintain this government and to pay that debt." In other words, the debt that he owed to the Union for the advantages that he had had in his short life. And unfortunately, he was killed soon after that in battle. But that was his use of self-expression to explain to his wife, soon to be widow, um, why he was willing to be in this war and to fight, and to express the ideals that were important to him. And I think kids, students in middle school and high school, especially, are starting to feel that um, impulse to be part of something bigger and to have a profound motivation for their actions or profound impact on the world. And if you can get them writing, just based on maybe reading or hearing, something like this letter read, um, they can have a vicarious, experience of that kind of profundity and role in history.
Yeah, and I mean our teenagers are so still so impressionable. Like I just think sometimes we think that they are already fully formed humans because they're the pressures that we place on them and these big life decisions that they now have to make with the stakes. Like that's something we keep talking about in this space is, having to decide like what your major is and what, are you going to go to engineering school when you're 13 so that you can like line up all of your summers and things like that. It's just, it is robbing our kids of that like time for exploration and they really are not fully formed. So when you're telling that story, it makes me think like these kids have so much potential to just be in that space of self exploration. And then as they grow and mature, as they should developmentally, at that point then they might be ready to see like what their passion is and what they really want to do.
Yeah, you know, I'm sure every generation says, kids these days or
Yeah.
the system these days or whatever. But there was something that I think when you and I were kids that still existed that doesn't really exist in most places now, and that is that free time to explore and create games and have to make up the rules and have to engage one-on-one in person with other people over disputes or over perceived slights or just disagreements on the rules or whatever. Um, and a lot of that took place outside, but for somebody who was as nerdy a kid as I was, a lot of it took place inside too, whether it was playing D&D with my friends or whether it was just writing my own magazines or whatever I was doing, and showing my sister or my friends. So yeah, I think in one-on-one instruction, you can enter that mode of being almost like a substitute peer if you are willing to go to kind of these creative places and to come up with assignments that allow for a lot of freedom in the student. Recently I assigned a student to create a travel log as if they were a historical figure. And my original idea was for it to be kind of written in the style of whatever century this person was from. And my student chose Marco Polo, and I was like, okay, I was kind of helping him learn what it might be like to write like a 13th century or 14th century traveler. But he started writing it as if he were in the 21st century, and he was leaving like reviews on Google Maps or something, and it was so funny that I was like, okay, I'm going to scrap, whatever my assignment said this was
Yeah.
about. I'm going to let this kid run with this. Um, and it was brilliant. It really was one of the most creative things, filled with anachronisms that were just awesome. And um, yeah, so I think that was an example, of how I had an idea of how I was going to be able to teach the material, but in the one-on-one setting, I didn't have to worry about maintaining the standards or the particular rubric or whatever for the rest of the class because there was no rest of the class. So I was able to adapt it to this kid's sort of flair for creativity and his idea of what he wanted to say, and it turned out to be one of the best things I've received in a long time. So
Oh my gosh, I couldn't love that story more, and I'm really laughing because I have teenage boys who all are using all of this Gen Alpha slang. I mean, it is all over social media, like just trying to keep up with the new, words that they're using. They're hilarious and make no sense. And I do think every generation had those things, and so just picturing Marco Polo saying "bruh" and all these things, it sounds very funny. But I love how you put that because it and like the parallel you're drawing to almost play, it's like intellectual play in a way, um without constraint, but like really kind of understanding the message, which is learning about what it was like for Marco Polo. But really there's that connection with and using the creativity piece that we don't get to. I mean, I absolutely love that, and it's why I love what we do at Pacific Prep. I mean, this is not an infomercial, but there's many ways that families can seek out this kind of enrichment or relationship with a teacher so that they can have that piece of intellectual play and get somewhere, get something
absolutely,
out of it. Yeah.
you know, mammals in general learn through play. We are the only mammal who has taken the natural way that we learn and tried to systematize and automatize it. And in the early 20th century, our country consciously chose this sort of institutional model of education as the best way to instill the values that we as a country thought were important to Americanness and to progress and to you being a good capitalist and everything else. Um, and I think increasingly we have seen the many fundamental flaws in that way of teaching and learning. So yeah, whatever we can do, whether it's in a case by case basis, or whether it's some larger institutional impact where we start to move to a new paradigm, whatever we can do to get back to a play based form of learning, I think is critical.
Absolutely. Well, and I think the last little topic that I wanted to kind of pick your brain or just like hear your perspective on, you've worked with so many kids who have gone down these alternative paths. They were not in a brick and mortar school for however long that was. For those kids that you've maybe followed or you've seen, the outcome, like what do you see what benefits or negative things or anything, like what observations do you have about kids who have kind of gone a different way in terms of like the traditional education?
Yeah, I've been fortunate to stay in touch with a lot of my students over the years. Um, and I think the one thing that unites, at least the ones who have kept in touch with me, uh, is a sense of knowing themselves at a young
Mm,
age. We all spend our lifetimes striving to get to know ourselves better and to be able to uh, think and act and speak with more coherence and authenticity. Um, and it's very, very hard, as a teenager and a person in their 20s, say, to be able to do that. But I find that kids who have been through a homeschooling program or even just a temporary, one-on-one program, who have felt seen and heard and who have been allowed to explore and self-express and ask questions. Um, those kids kind of figure out who they are more quickly, I think, or they at least have a person or hopefully a whole team of people that they can talk to, reach out to, if they have a question about a moral quandary or an identity crisis or an existential, question that they're grappling with. Um, and I mean, it's an incredible honor, to be able to be that person that gets that text and says, "What should I do?" Um, and uh, and just to watch those kids grow and mature and find themselves, faster. I think that's the biggest gift that this kind of, education platform can offer.
I love that. I see it every day too, in our work. So, okay. Well, Matt, lastly, we've been asking all of our guests this season to share a book recommendation. You are very well read, and so I'm sure it was really hard to narrow it down, but can you give us a book recommendation?
Sure. I think I would like to recommend Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. A lot of people, listeners, viewers, may have seen the movie Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. And that film is based on about a 80 or 90 page chunk of the book Team of Rivals. Of course, the screenplay was written by the brilliant Tony Kushner, but yeah, her book was sort of the source material, and it's a book about Abraham Lincoln and how when he sort of unexpectedly won the nomination in 1860 for the then nascent Republican Party. Um, he had many rivals who had all thought they had better claim to the nomination than he did. And he brought every single one of those people into his cabinet and understood that they were brilliant people who had something to offer him and the country. And I just think, the book is an incredible exploration of that kind of leadership and the growth mindset, I think, that Abraham Lincoln showed, which can be a model for all of us as we go through our own identity and leadership sort of, journeys. So
Oh
that
my
would be my
goodness.
recommendation.
My goodness, that is really timely in terms of how divisive our country is right now in politics. Like it seems inconceivable to even think of, whoever wins the nomination or the presidency to bring in all of their rivals. Like what a bold thing to do. So
Yeah.
really courageous. So all right,
Yeah.
wonderful. Well, I will definitely put that on my list. And Matt, this has been absolutely lovely. I expected it to be so. Like I said at the outset, I know it's embarrassing to hear it, but you really are a team favorite. Like families absolutely love working with you, and it's your creativity and dedication to your students is really like unrivaled. So we just appreciate you having you on the team and just hearing your perspective today.
Well, thank you for saying that, and thank you to Tutor Corps and Pacific Preparatory for all these years of finding me just incredible kids to work with. It's such a joy and a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Everybody take care.
Okay. Bye bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forget What You Learned. hosted by me, Corey Greenberg. As always, our goal is to allow you to zoom out on the snapshot of your family's life and answer the question, are my kids thriving? We're here to inspire you to make those small and maybe big changes to answer yes. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Pacific Preparatory and Tutor Corps, sister organizations committed to educating students with an innovative and holistic approach in today's digital world. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a rating and review. See you next time.